Well, hello and welcome to this live dialogue on interfaith responses to the coronavirus crisis. So I'm Andrew Schwartz, and I have the privilege of being the moderator for today's event. I first want to say a special thank you to our co-sponsors, the Institute for Ecological Civilization, the Center for Process Studies, Claremont School of Theology, and United Religions Initiative. So transforming and transitioning toward an ecological civilization, or what we might call a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world, a world that works for all, this cannot be accomplished without leadership and support from faith communities and interfaith cooperation. And today's panel of experts will be discussing the coronavirus pandemic and the ways that faith and interfaith communities can and are responding to these challenging times by caring for the overall well-being of people on the planet. So we have a wonderful group of six famous panelists with us today. First is Victor Kazanjian. He is Executive Director of United Religions Initiative, a global grassroots interfaith peace-building network of over 1,000 groups working in more than 100 countries and at the United Nations to build bridges of cooperation between people of all beliefs and cultures. Prior to joining URI, Victor served as Dean of Intercultural Education and Religious and Spiritual Life, and co-director of the Peace and Justice Studies program at Wellesley College. So Victor is also an ordained priest in the Episcopal Church and was trained as a community organizer working to address the systemic causes of poverty and injustice through the support of community-based programs. It's great to have you with us, Victor. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
Milia Islam-Majeed is the Executive Director of South Coast Interfaith Council, the largest and oldest interfaith council in California. California being a very big place. She is the daughter of immigrant parents who migrated to the US from Bangladesh. Milia is a graduate of Harvard University, where she earned a master's in theological studies of the world's religions and anthropology. Some of her very astounding and impressive recognitions include receiving the USA Network 2010 Character Night Award, an NAACP 2011 Woman of the Year in Long Beach. She was selected in 2015 as one of the future 50 emerging leaders under the age of 35 who are shaping the landscape of faith in Los Angeles. And most recently, in 2017, Milia was chosen as one of the 11 individuals worldwide to be a research fellow at the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT, where her research focuses on the intersection of Islam and ethics. So it's brilliant to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph Prabhu is a professor of philosophy emeritus from California State University, Los Angeles, and is former president of the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. With advanced degrees in both economics and philosophy of religion, his work has primarily been in the areas of Western and Indian philosophy, comparative religion, as well as the social and political theory. For 12 years, Joseph served as founding co-chair of the Southern California Committee for a Parliament of the World's Religions, and for 7 years served on the Board of Trustees for the Global Parliament of the World's Religions. He's the author and editor of several books, including 2 forthcoming books, look really exciting. Ramon Panikkar, a modern spiritual master, and Liberating Gandhi, Building Community and a Culture of Peace. I also want to especially thank Joseph for playing such a special role in organizing today's panel and helping us be here. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Andrew.
Ruth Broyd-Sharon, also with us today, is an interfaith leader, filmmaker, and journalist. She is the producer-director of the award-winning documentary, God and the Law Need to Talk. What a beautiful title. Her interfaith memoir, Minefields and Miracles, is considered a primer for interfaith engagements, having received 3 literary awards and an endorsement from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Ruth was a co-founder of the Southern California Parliament of the World's Religions and served as co-chair for 10 years. For 17 years, she was also active as a member of the Muslim-Jewish Women's Dialogue Group in Los Angeles. As a firm believer in the power of the arts to touch hearts and change minds, Ruth created This Is Who We Are, the interfaith musical, which she calls an ode to our cultural and religious diversity. So I highly recommend going to YouTube after this and listening to some of her work. Wonderful. Thank you, Ruth. Philip Clayton is also with us, joining us from Claremont, California. He is Ingram Professor of Theology and Director of the PhD program in Comparative Theologies and Philosophies at Claremont School of Theology. Philip's also co-founder and president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, where he works to support multi-sector innovations toward a sustainable and just society through collaborations between governments, businesses, policy experts, and NGOs. As a constructive Christian theologian, Philip is deeply engaged in dialogues with science, contemporary philosophy, and the world's religious traditions. He's author and editor of more than 25 books, including What is Ecological Civilization?, The Oxford Handbook of Science and Religion, Panentheism Across the World's Traditions, and a forthcoming title, What's Free Will? Ethics and Religion After Neuroscience, just a sampling of some of his work. So Philip, it's great to have you with us. Last and certainly not least is Taranjeet Singh Bhutalia, who's Executive Director of Religions for Peace USA, a professor at Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes. He has been a servant leader in the interfaith movement for over 2 decades, including service as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Parliament of the World's Religions, as well as the North American Interfaith Network. He is a founding trustee of Sikh Council for Interfaith Relations and former advisory board member of the Journal for Interreligious Studies. He has served on the board of National Religious Coalition Against Torture, as well as World Sikh Council America Religion. In 2016, he was awarded a Luminosa Award for Unity, and locally he works with interfaith associations for Central Ohio for over 20 years, and then is co-editor of the landmark Ohio bicentennial book, Religion in Ohio, Profiles of Faith Communities.
Thank you, Andrew, and go Bucks.
Yeah, go Bucks. So our format today is roughly 40 minutes of panel discussion and conversation, followed by 40 minutes of Q&A with our live audience. So audience, if you have questions for our panelists, you can submit those one of 3 ways: using the comments feature on Facebook Live, if that's how you're joining us, using the Q&A feature on Zoom, if that's how you're joining us, or by tweeting your questions using the hashtag Lifting Spirits. So as we get warmed up, I think we'd all like to hear a little bit from each of our panelists, and they'd like to share a brief, uplifting word of wisdom. So, Milia, would you like to start?
The first one? Oh my goodness, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us, and I'm honored to be a part of this panel and conversing with my colleagues here. So, you know, I thought about, okay, what can I say within the span of 90 seconds, right? And like 30 is already gone. But I think one of the things I really want to share or start out with is talking about this whole pandemic that, you know, history often repeats itself, and that's what we see, right? This pandemic, these crises it's not something new. It's something that has existed before as well. And purely from a theological point of view, I just wanted to emphasize one thing in this kind of an introduction. Oftentimes pandemics such as these are considered to be like tests from God within the Islamic framework. And there's particularly a theologian, 14th century Muslim theologian by the name of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who said something so beautiful about this concept of tests or testing times. He said that, you know, during these tests or testing times, God closes one door with his wisdom and opens 2 doors with his mercy, right? So the point being is that certainly it's not negating the fact that there is a challenge, but at the same time, it's also shedding light on the fact that there's greater answer and that we're capable of reaching that answer and the importance of that. And I think just even this forum right here is a manifestation of a mercy like that, for us to come together and dialogue about the importance of ecology and what we can do to make sure that something like this doesn't happen to the extent that it's happening right now.
That's brilliant. Who would like to go next? That's a tough act to follow. Taranjeet, what do you think?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate you moderating us, and we hope we all will behave under your leadership today. What do I want to share with you? Today has not been an easy day for me. This was not how I planned today to unfold. I just returned from a funeral of a friend who passed away. His mom passed away. Her funeral was just a couple of hours ago. And so I would like to share a prayer from the Sikh faith that I have found to give solace to me. And I share an English translation with you. The world is in flames. Shower it with your mercy. Save it by any means that you can save it. The everlasting Guru has provided relief through the everlasting word. O Nanak, there is none else so merciful and benevolent as God. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. Let's see, going across my screen, Victor.
Thank you so much. It is so lovely to be with this group of friends and to be with folks who are gathering in the midst of the sadness, in the midst of the struggle, as we weep. I think in our tears, we experience that we are connected. Even in a time of physical distancing, we are soul connected to each other. And one of the things that the Indigenous community continues to bring to our world is that the earth as our mother is our teacher. And that as we reconnect with each other, as we open our hearts to each other, we also learn that in nature, we're part of one global, interdependent, planetary system. And we learn that over and over again. And in the context of this pandemic, we are reminded again of how deeply interconnected we are to each other and to this earth.
Indeed. Joseph.
Well, like Milia and Taranjit and Victor, I would also like to thank you, Andrew, and Philip, and the Institute of Ecological Civilization for hosting this. I'll have something to say, as I'm sure others will as well, about the importance of ecological civilization. But in this context, to start off, like Milia and others, I want to defer to other wise people, in this case, the great mystic Thomas Merton, who said, we do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where things are going. What we do need is to recognize the possibility and the challenges offered by the present moment, and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope. So one of the things that I will be emphasizing is how we might live in this time of uncertainty, where, as others have indicated, an old order seems to be ending and a new one gradually starting, and the birth pangs are always painful. But in this period of uncertainty, I think it's a challenge which we face together with each other's support to walk a fine line between rational fear and caution on the one hand, and irrational anxiety and paranoia on the other. We see plenty of the latter, and to be able to have the wisdom to walk that fine line, I think, is one of the things that we'll explore this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth.
First of all, thank you to our sponsors, and a very warm acknowledgement to all of my colleagues today on the panel. I love you all. You know, this is such an extraordinary opportunity. It's the spiritual people, and I've been reading this online now for over a year, consider this a portal and a moment when the collective consciousness of people around the world can be uplifted and ascend. And, you know, on the one hand, when we hear the statistics, and some of us actually know people who have died from the pandemic, we say it feels like a curse. And actually, it started becoming really, the news and the statistics were hitting the Jewish community right in the middle of Passover, when we recite the plagues, the 10 plagues, and all of us who had our seders at home without our friends and without strangers at the table and without our extended family, we were thinking to ourselves, is this a modern day plague? But I would like to suggest something else, that with the terrible distress of losing loved ones and not being able to leave our homes and not be able to give hugs, there is an extraordinary moment here of blessing. And if we, at the end of this, can recognize something in each other, in every other that we didn't before, then it has been a great gift. And I guess I would just want to share with you, because nowadays, when anything happens, I always think, oh yeah, that's one of the songs in the musical. So just some short lines. What if when we awoke after Corona, we were wearing a stranger's shoes? What if when we awoke, we shared our enemies' extremist views? What if when we awoke, we think in color, not black and white? What if when we awoke, we could imagine not being right? And wouldn't that be a great blessing? So.
Indeed, thank you. Philip.
I think I simply want to emphasize the simple spiritual focus on the present. We wish we were looking out over an audience in a room where we could see you moving and smiling and frowning and nodding and shaking your heads vehemently. And instead, all of us are here staring at a screen and trying to make contact. One of our staff members said recently, I haven't been hugged in weeks. Oh. And that's a way of evoking that sense that we're not touching. In the last week, as May has broken and people have longed for what normally feels like the birth of summer, I felt a heaviness on people around us. So the quest is, where do we find hope? And I thought of the African theologian Kazanjian, who uses phrases like hope draped in black, or the birth of hope in lament, or my favorite expression, hope in ruins. Trauma hope, Catherine Keller writes in a recent Theology of the Earth. So what strikes me as the most deep at this moment, that names the moment, are what Catherine Keller describes as the attentive practices of thought, love, rage, and care. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. So thank you all for sharing those brief words of wisdom to get us started. I think what I'm hearing is that we all recognize that we're in a challenging time that provides both obstacles and opportunities. I hope we get a chance to talk about both sides of that coin. But starting with the challenges, right? It seems as if the world has been turned upside down. Our schools and businesses have been closed. Our worship services and religious gatherings have been canceled or gone viral. As Philip said, some people said it, how long has it been since I've had a hug? So I'm wondering, how has the coronavirus pandemic impacted your faith communities, and what sort of pandemic-related challenges are you facing in your interfaith work? Anybody feel free to jump in.
Ranjit here. I'll jump in first, and I will always try to be brief. I'm a university professor, so like Joseph and Phil, we know we only need to speak as much as we need to. For the Sikh community, it has been particularly difficult because so much of my religious tradition depends on building a community of believers that we interact with. And within my religious tradition, a Sikh gets salvation when we see God's light in everyone. And that's not just people from my religious tradition. From all different people, we see God's light. And actually being able to have that Sangat or that community is extremely important for a Sikh to be grounded. And so that's the community part that I miss the most. So that's probably the fundamental challenge that I and many Sikhs have. And there are a few worship services that are being done online for the Sikh faith, but not as many. And so that's the part of what I really miss from my own religious tradition. And also with people of faith that we all hug and work with, we meet each other, we have these smiles, and that's what we still miss, is, as Philip said, the human touch.
I'd like to go next. Judaism was created, we believe, at Mount Sinai, when simultaneously 600,000 people heard the word of God. And so, unlike other religions that have come through one particular individual who was enlightened or who shared the understanding of divinity, we heard it all as a community. And it's considered important to have 10 people, we call it a minyan, when we pray publicly together. So the whole idea of tearing apart the notion of community for Jews is like taking away what defines us. And it's curious, you know, I learned in my studies many years ago, it's astounded me. I always thought that the first thing that Jews would build when they establish a new community would be a synagogue. But I discovered that the first thing they do is put together a burial society so that no one would ever die alone. And that notion of being with another human being at the most tender of moments, when I heard the story that Phil said about his colleague needing a hug, I mean, those of us who are lucky enough to have someone near us, we don't experience it to that extreme degree, but the amount of loneliness that's taking place right now is an indication of how much we need one another. And I wanted to share something very briefly that I got from, his name is Rabbi Ephraim Silver from Marietta, Georgia, about his daughter who, 3 years old, when she woke up, she says, "Is it still Corona?" That was her first question. And she feels that life is not normal now and she wants to get back to normal. But Judaism wants us, he writes, wants us to share the view of the world that we live in, even without Corona, as an aberration and temporary and dysfunctional and compromised, because the Jewish faith says that a world in which there is injustice, discrimination, pain, sorrow, greed, dishonesty, hate, and war is a broken world. And so even when, let's say, a vaccine is developed, and even when we're going back to our usual activities, the world still needs our care. The vaccine is not going to do for us what we need to do in the recognition of this humanity that we all share. And if the world, if there is injustice and greed and sorrow and so forth, then we haven't finished our work. And so I think that the Corona brings into sharp relief what it is we need to be doing when we all go back into the world.
Brilliant.
Can I step in here?
Please.
For me, the central Christian ethical command is given in Matthew 25, that when people are hungry, you feed them. When they are thirsty, you give them to drink. When they are in prison, you visit them. And I want to juxtapose that with our social location. Here we are in North America, where, of course, we, this has already been mentioned, are lacking hugs and lacking the kind of social interaction that we are used to. But I just want for a moment, because three of us, even though we are now speaking in North America, come from the so-called underdeveloped world, though of course what counts as development is an open question. In many respects, I would submit America is extremely underdeveloped, as this pandemic is showing. But I just wanted to say that some of the things that we take for granted here in America, even in this crisis, where we are frequently enjoined to wash our hands, but in Bangladesh and in India, where Taranjit and I come from, there is no water to wash one's hands. And likewise, one of our safety measures here is social distancing. But if you live in a slum in India or Bangladesh, there is no possibility of social distancing. So I just want to raise that up because while all of us are suffering in varying degrees, the suffering of the poor and the marginalized is by far the greatest. It's a matter of regret to me that we could not bring an African American on the panel this time, because the suffering to the African American and to various marginalized communities is by far the most severe. I mean, I don't need to cite the statistics. This is well known. So just as on a global scale, the peoples of Africa and India and Bangladesh are suffering infinitely more than you and I are suffering, so also within America, the homeless, the poor are being disproportionately affected. And so as a Christian, I need to have, and I hope as a human being, that we need to have that sensitivity that while we are being challenged, others are being challenged infinitely more.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anybody else like to speak to the challenges you're experiencing in your community?
I would like to just, add one thing, because this concerns Victor as well, and URI. I was on a call yesterday morning with a group of women from all over the world. It's one of the cooperative circles. Women from Argentina and Brazil and Africa, Kenya, Venezuela, Pakistan, and Israel, and a few of the women, and this speaks to what Joseph just said, the ones from Pakistan and Africa were the hardest hit. They talked about the rise of domestic violence. They talked about people being killed, being shot, coming back from the grocery store because the person with the gun needed to feed his family. So this is in extremis, but these things, I mean, we finished the call and most of us were in tears because we realized that those of us who are having a more comfortable way of being quarantined can't really appreciate the degree of depression and angst that is being experienced by large populations around the world. And Victor, URI is a vehicle for sharing that with people all over the world. And so I was so grateful for the organization and what it does in the world today, more than 1,000 cooperative circles.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Milia, I think you were going to speak, please.
Yeah, you know, within the Muslim community, I think particularly at this time, you know, we're actually in the midst of Ramadan, right, which is regarded as one of the most sacred times within the Muslim faith, and a month of fasting, a month of contemplation, a month of prayer, and most certainly a month of community. And I think what I find really fascinating is the challenges that we're facing as a Muslim community is almost like a little microcosm of the challenges that we're facing as a whole world at this time, right? So what do I mean by that? You know, just like my friends here said, community is so central. Community is central in all faith traditions, even the monastics, right? There's a time when they even embark within the community because they realize that, you know, we're interconnected with one another. So certainly we don't have that right now, which is, you know, very difficult because in addition to the 5 daily prayers during Ramadan, every night there's congregational prayers for 1 hour, 2 hours, you know, and it's a sense of community. But at the same time, you know, I've always kind of been a person who looks at the positive side of things as well. And I'm constantly reminded of this verse in the Quran, right? And this verse in the Quran says that it specifically, when you do it, it says, indeed, with hardship comes ease. And so when you look at that verse itself, and what's really interesting, and if you know Arabic, it's phenomenal. But what's really, really interesting is that it doesn't say that with ease, it doesn't say that ease comes after the hardship. What it says is that ease comes with the hardship, right? So what does that mean? So basically it's saying that hardship is a decree from God. If we all are, you know, faithful people, we recognize, if we believe in a God, that it all comes from God. However, at the same time, it also says that ease is also decreed at the same time, right? So that means that if we look closely, and if we truly contemplate, you'll see that you will find an opportunity to be of ease to someone, right? Just like how God has the opportunity to bestow ease on us. And I think that's tremendous value, because that means even in my little microcosm of my home, I can help my husband, you know, when he's feeling down, whatever it may be, I'm there for him. And on a macro level, you know, this mercy that we bestow towards one another, it's just not to humankind, it's to all of humanity, including people or beings that are not humans, right? this concept of tawheed is really central to Islam. And it talks about the unity of God, the unity of people, the unity of God, people, and the universe. Because all the universe, and it talks about, it's beautifully stated, it talks about how all of the universe, they're constantly praising the greatness of God. And it's us who are, destroying that in many ways, right? And that there's a sense of accountability that's also bestowed upon us. So I think, this time of contemplation, specifically for Ramadan, I think for me, it takes a additional level, because it's not just about contemplating, where am I? Hey, am I doing enough good? Did I do my 5 daily prayers? Or, oh my God, I didn't do this. But it's really also making us realize, what we need to be held accountable for that's outside of ourselves as well. And that's all of humanity and all of the world and all of the creatures within the world. But again, like I said, I firmly believe that, as the Quran says, with hardship comes ease, that it's two sides of the same coin. And it's really our responsibility to bestow that ease in the world that we live in.
Wonderful. I see you nodding your head, Victor.
Yeah, no, and it's so moving. And Ruth, thank you this is the third time today I've heard about that call. And people have the women of the world gathering to connect, to talk about those things that are often not talked about in public, of the kind of secret lives of what happens in situations of violence, and it's so powerful and moving. And I live in that interfaith space. I have this great joy of serving a global community of interfaith peace builders who are comforting those who are suffering, and feeding those who are hungry, and praying for those who are struggling, and promoting good health practices, and advocating for the vulnerable, and confronting those who would use this crisis to divide people. And probably most importantly, connecting people who are in isolation to each other and to one another. And in some ways, that's what interfaith peace builders, that's what folks do every day, whether it's a pandemic or not a pandemic. But I think the challenges, the two that come to mind at this moment, one is engaging the grief. Mm-hmm. And the grief could be the grief of loss from loved ones. And also the grief could be the loss of a livelihood, or the loss of a life that was lived in a certain way, the loss of physical connection, of human connection. There are a million different losses that constellate the grieving that we're going through in this moment. And one of the things we know about grief is that if it doesn't get engaged as grief, it moves grievance. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things we're seeing now, particularly in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well, is the unengaged grief starts to move towards grievance and looks for external blame. And why is this happening? Why is my life? Unfortunately, we have too many political leaders who are doing that and playing off that grief in others, and playing off the grievance to mobilize people around that grievance, when in fact, what we're called to, and certainly all our traditions, the wisdom traditions of the world, call us to move into that grief, to experience that sadness, to feel it, to own it, to know that we have the capacity, the great capacity, to hold an immense amount of sadness, an immense amount of grief, without turning on each other. And in fact, in that grief, in our sadness, we find a deep connection to each other, perhaps more profound than in any other way. That the common experience of human beings or of animal life is that one of that loss of a connection, the loss in this case of so many elements. One of the challenges is, how do we move into the grief?
Yeah, no doubt that is one of the challenges. So in times of crisis, and I think you were all speaking to this, it's often our faith communities that help keep us grounded. And this pandemic, like all crises, it seems to be bringing out the best and the worst in folks. So what are some resources within your respective traditions, some insights and resources that you think are especially useful in responding to the present pandemic situation, addressing some of the challenges that you just mentioned that could help bring out the best in people in times of crisis? Taranjeet, I think you're muted.
Okay, I have unmuted myself. As many of you are aware that Langar, the Sikh community meal, is a huge component of the Sikh faith. So what has occurred across the country is that since we can come together and eat, many gurdwaras come together, cook the food, they pack them up in boxes. And while they themselves are not able to go out and deliver those packages to those who need, they can either come and pick the packages up at the gurdwara, or they partner with other local religious communities of different religious traditions and civic organizations like Rotary Club and others to be able to deliver the food. So what I would suggest is those of us who are on the call, if you're looking to volunteer for something, go find a local gurdwara and ask them how you can be of help. And I think the way I look at it is we have to walk the talk. And it's really what, like politics, all interreligious work is also local. And that's, I think, where we make a meaningful impact. So that's where I think my own religious community at the local level has been working. At the international level, we have an organization called Khalsa Aid, which has been primarily working outside the US, in Africa and in Asia, in providing smaller religious communities, as the one Joseph Prabhu had mentioned, many in South Asia and Africa, who are we think that we have poverty in this country. Yes, we do. But looking at some other parts of the world, which, as Joseph said, are so-called underdeveloped, and I have been to some of those, it is horrendous. And so I think we are all in this together, and we have to care for the very least amongst us. And that's the only way out for us together as a community. But I do see a silver lining. I do see people being more kind, being more compassionate, more caring. Before the pandemic hit, I would take my dog out for a walk. Now, my dog takes me out for a walk a couple of times a day. And I have met so many more neighbors that I had never seen before on the sidewalk behind my home who would say hi, and our dogs would sniff each other now, and we would talk for like 10 minutes, keeping the social distancing. So I think there are blessings that have come through this, where I feel I know many of my neighbors a lot more thanks to my dog.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think, the idea of blessings is important, because many of us have sort of stressed the two-sided nature of this crisis: hardship on the one hand, ease on the other, danger on the one hand, opportunity on the other. And I'll say two things in this context. One is to pick up on what Milia said, that of course this is the month of Ramadan, and the tradition of iftar, where the fast is broken at the end of one of the most rigorous fasts that exist in all religions, which is a communal activity, is of course now being forced to be done virtually. But many organizations, and I'm thinking of New Ground, one of the most dynamic Muslim Jewish youth organizations, had an iftar where 1,400 people sort of joined in. And it's an opportunity, I think, and I'm going to elaborate that briefly in a minute. While, of course, we derive our sustenance and our resources from our respective traditions, this panel is an interfaith panel. And for a moment, I want to delve into the inter. And the example that I gave of an interfaith sharing in the iftar, all right, is one among many examples. I think one of the challenges that people like Victor and Taranjeet in Religions for Peace engage in is to say that while, of course, we are rooted in a particular community, what it means to be religious or spiritual or whatever word one wants to use, has a global aspect. And I would hope that this crisis helps us to realize something, again, that others have mentioned, that we are all in this together, but applied at the level of faith communities. It's for faith communities to now rise to the challenge of saying that we can't stay within our silos, we can't stay within our particular practices. We face a dire crisis together, and the other side of the coin, we together can make a big difference. As Martin Luther King famously said, we're all woven into a common web of humanity, all right? And it's in moments like this where we realize how precarious that web is and how it calls for our interfaith cooperation and collaboration.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump in for a moment first I wanted to say one of the secrets of Jewish survival after 3,500 years is humor. And every situation always has an appropriate joke, and I hope you'll indulge me. First of all, you all remember right after it was announced that we would have to wear masks, within 2 days, a video appeared which was mask maker, make me a mask. But I was thinking about one of the jokes that we like to tell about ourselves, that it was announced it was the end of the world, and all the congregations were scurrying about and people were trying to figure out what to do. And so the Catholic priest called his congregation together and he said, make sure you all take communion. This is the moment. If you have accepted Christ as your savior, there won't be any problem. And then a minister called his congregation together and he said, I warned you, this is because you haven't been behaving well and this is what comes of it. And then the rabbi called his congregation together and he said, friends, the world is sinking. It's going to be covered in water. We need to learn to live underwater in 48 hours. And the idea, of course, being whatever it is, we have to figure it out. And I think that elasticity under adversity is something that we tell about ourselves, and that I see is true of the interfaith community. What do I mean by that? A few years ago, I attended a talk by Diana Eck at the Pluralism Project in Boston at Harvard, and she said there was a time when there were incidents, acts of violence against one of the religious communities, where they would have to call each person from each community and see whether they could get collaboration. She said the beauty of the interfaith community now around the world is that when something happens, immediately there's a network that exists and people are already there. We don't need to make friends with them. We don't need to develop trust with them, because friendship and trust and solidarity is already there. And so I think that's something special about the interfaith community. Now, each community has its own network that way, but today to be able to say out of I think there are about 4,380 religions in the world, that we have this advanced golden web, I called it, around the world where people immediately respond to crisis, not just for themselves, but in particular, if they see one of the communities is at risk, they will go out to the streets and they will stand there in solidarity. And I've seen that happen with Muslims doing that for Jews, and Jews doing that for Muslims, and for the Coptic community and so forth. So that is the good news, that we get to see that web and we can say to ourselves, we have done work that is valuable and that will last, because that web, just like in Spider-Man, it can stretch, but it is it will not break. It is extremely strong.
Thank you, and thanks for the Spider-Man reference. I always appreciate that. So people online are really wanting to know about examples and actions that can be taken And I think we talk about the challenges that we're facing. We also talk about the opportunities, but what are some of these sort of new opportunities you see for interfaith collaboration in this time of crisis? Are there some encouraging examples that are taking place in your communities? I know, Taranjeet, you have some slides you'd like to share about opportunities for interfaith action. Maybe now you can do that.
Thank you. As some of you might be aware, that the US chapter of Religions for Peace is one among 100 chapters of Religions for Peace International. And the parent organization has launched a multi-religious humanitarian fund in response to COVID. And you should be able to see that on my screen. And there is seed money which is being provided to serve the humanitarian needs globally. And so anybody can apply for this, but the important part here is you have to work across faith lines to serve the needs of your local community. And below here is the application deadline. The applications are due 5 days from today on May 10th. So I would encourage local multi-religious coalitions who would like to serve the local needs of their communities across the world, not just the US, to be able to apply. And these are concrete things local interfaith councils can do to work together. And the second one is that RFP USA is organizing this coming Thursday, as some of you might be aware, is the National Day of Prayer in the United States, which in the last several years has been predominantly being promoted by the evangelical Christian community. But as such, the designation of this day by the US Congress is open to any and all who would want to pray. And so this coming Thursday, the event, very much like the one we are on here, will be by Zoom and Facebook. It is on May 7th at 2 o'clock, and the registration information is at the bottom on the screen. If you need more information, please go to our website, www.rfpusa.org. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Actually, that reminds me, Victor, would you like to say a word or two about URI cooperation circles?
Sure, and thank you to Ranjita and Ruth and all for this. There are so many practical examples, and one of the things that is a challenge right now is that in people consuming their media through online news sources and even through social media, we often see the faces and words of people who are in sort of high positions of power and leadership. They're dominating the news. Not only in the United States is it sort of shutting out news from the rest of the world, which is dangerous and deeply troubling, but it's also not allowing us to see that everyday actions of people of all beliefs who are working together in their communities at a local level, at the grassroots. And so in URI, which is this wonderful community united religions initiative of grassroots people of all beliefs working together very locally in their communities to build relationships, build enduring relationships with each other, deepen their understanding of each other, dispel stereotypes, dispel prejudice, but then acting, moving into their communities to act on issues that are crucial, humanitarian issues that are crucial in their communities. If you go to the URI.org website, we have a coronavirus page, which you will see all these activities, all these engaged activities that people are doing in their communities all over the world. And I get to see this every day because my email and my Facebook feed is about good news stories of people of all beliefs working together to change their communities. So I have this unique vantage point that most people don't have, and yet you can find in places like Religions for Peace, in places like URI, and in other local interfaith organizations, with all these stories of people who are crossing boundaries of belief and worldview in order to work together. Now, just to say one other thing about this is, one of the things the virtual environment allows us to do is it allows us to travel. Not travel outside of our homes or travel outside of our countries, but it allows us to travel into the spaces that other people are shaping and hosting and engaging. And in the interfaith world, there's an invitation for people to come and visit and explore through websites, through virtual gatherings, through Facebook Live times, where we all can expand our understanding of the beautiful diversity of belief that makes up the fabric of humanity. And we can learn and listen and engage so that at the same time that there is a massive effort to divide people, drive people into places of fear and isolation, into the sort of balkanized world of our own communities of identity, we can challenge that by seeking out to visit others in their spaces and learn and laugh, as Ruth said, and grow. And we can explore and deepen our understanding and our relationships in the virtual spaces. And everybody on this screen has beautiful things that they're sharing and saying, and communities are doing, who people can join and engage and deepen and insist that we are one united, interdependent human family, and that we will not be divided. We will not be divided.
I wanted to say something about what happened to the interfaith organizations in the last few years, which I think is very significant and symbolic of the direction we're heading. Religions for Peace and the Parliament of the World's Religions and URI were supportive of each other, but they were very separate organizations. And something extraordinary has happened. So Audrey Kitagawa, who is the president of the Board of Trustees, is now also connected to Religions for Peace. And Tarunji he's connected to all the organizations by virtue of what he does. And what I see, there's a kind of synergy that's happening between the major organizations. And it occurred to me, this is an idea that just came to me right now. You know, just like there's a suicide hotline that exists for people who are thinking of taking their life, what if we had an interfaith lifeline for people? All the organizations got together and created a place where people could just go one click, they go there and they could find out what's happening in their town, what are the local interfaith organizations, what could they join, what could they do? Because if you're getting that many questions from the audience saying, what can we do? This is the moment, friends, when people are saying, what can we do? Where we need to give them something specific, not just an ideal, but really grassroots, what they can do. So I'm putting it out there today. Could these three organizations create something together, a lifeline that is for interfaith understanding, and that could help everybody find what to do? Now, I just was thinking that a few years ago, I was writing for the Interfaith Observer for about 7-8 years. And one of the stories I wrote, which always tickles me when I think about it, is called Interfaith in Fargo, North Dakota. Can you believe it? That was the title. When I found someone online who wanted to buy a copy of my film, and when I called him and I said, you know, what brought you to that? He said, well, we have an interfaith group here in Fargo. I said, you do? You know, it was the most remote place I could think of where there might be an interfaith. So that means that this is not just an aberration any longer. It's interfaith is a household word now. It's not just two people from different faiths getting married. And it has a huge possibility still in the future, but I think the fact that the three main organizations have come together and have people on their board and their staff from the other organizations is a sign that it's time for all of us to create a different kind of global network for volunteering. And I'm suggesting that. So we have two people here who had two major organizations, Tarunji and Victor. So I'm saying, I challenge you.
Happening,
great challenge.
Which is wonderful. It's happening, and it is extraordinary because there's been a lot of isolation among interfaith communities. But you know, one of the lovely things right now is that Aza Karam, who's the new Secretary General of Religions for Peace, Audrey Kitagawa, and I happen to be dear friends. And so there's not only an organizational imperative, but there's a heart connection. And then with people like Taranjeet and others who it's time for us all to work together in this way. And I think that's an excellent idea.
Absolutely. Taranjeet is sharing his screen on purpose, I hope. Okay.
Yeah, we all are right there. Good job.
I'm unmuted myself. What I wanted to point out, what I think Ruth and Victor have said very well, although this event is being put together by RFP USA, you can see have the Bar of the World's Religions as a co-sponsor, the Temple of Understanding, the Northman Interfaith Network, URI, and some of the other local organizations. So I think, Ruth, your point is very well taken. We are slowly learning that the resources are limited, and we all need to work with each other and collectively, rather than what I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, what would have been called interfaith envy. And as somebody who is committed interfaith activist, I can say that, but I think we see that on the decline, where we all now know much better at the national, international level, we have to work together.
Absolutely.
You know, where we are much stronger together than we are apart. So I very much agree with what you said and what Victor has said. So thank you for raising that.
Philip, as somebody also interested in working together and networks and collaboration, I'd like to hear from you. You've been a little silent on the corner of my screen.
I'm loving the things that people are sharing. It strikes me that what makes this kind of collaboration possible is that each of our traditions calls us to an attentiveness to ourselves, to the things that arise within us, and to the pain that we see around us. Each of us has an understanding that the blessings of the Almighty come not just to one tradition, but to all traditions. The Quaker way of putting that is we recognize that of God in each one. I'm moved by the large-scale connections, but I'm moved by the specific stories that I find of clergy. And I'd like to share just 3 snippets because as I've been working with multi-faith clergy in classes during the COVID, those who are on the front lines, those who are learning how to do services for the first time without being able to meet in person. I think of the grief of a Pacific Islander clergy person who faced the first funeral ever where he couldn't let the community come together. The Pacific Islander funeral goes on for days. It's a time of massive connection of a large extended family or community together. And the first funeral where at first the clergy was allowed just into the funeral home with closest family, and now even that's not allowed, was a matter of incredible grief to the community and to the clergy. But now with time, he said, we're beginning to find that people from Tonga or relatives from Samoa are joining a funeral where the clergy person and the family are in Southern California. So we're finding a way to see ourselves as global community, even though we can't be in the same room. I think of a Hawaiian clergy who received food from the big hotel restaurants in the opening days of COVID when the restaurants were closing, and carried it out to that spot where the homeless of the Hawaiian island would tend to gather. And there by a park bench, it was possible in an informal way for members of religious communities to distribute food. And finally, in Northern California, the synagogue, there was a food program where the food would be distributed to the homeless people on multiple days of the week. Suddenly things were shut down, but also in the opening week or weeks of COVID, they said, well, we don't have to give up. We can no longer bring them into the building to shower, to recharge their cell phones, to eat, but we can bring the food outside. And so these 3 people who had been manning this station, this service for so long, moved everything out onto the street, the long tables, the food that could still be distributed, long electrical cords so that the phones could be recharged, and mostly just community, that people could be seen as human beings, appreciated, loved, and taken care of in that way. Love with a mask.
Beautiful.
Love with a mask. I love that. So there's a whole lot that's been coming in online with questions and things like that. One of the things that seems particularly interesting, so I know that responses to coronavirus has had really far-reaching social economic consequences. I think I already mentioned this has affected marginalized communities more so than many others. How has the pandemic been affecting your work on peace and justice, as many of you are working in that area?
I think that for me, and what we're seeing globally, is that systems that are based on unjust and unequal treatment of different people are just strained and exacerbated by this. We see a sort of global economic system that privileges some at the expense of many. And so in the economic worlds, in the health world, in the cultural engagement world, that all those places where inequities existed and where marginalized peoples suffered, a pandemic such as this not only reveals that deep injustice, but it also exacerbates it. And as we've said earlier, really falls, the burden falls heavy on those who are most marginalized and most targeted in communities. So I think that is clear. And I hope that we are willing as a human community to take up the question of this is an opportunity not to go back to the former normal, that there needs to be a new normal that's completely different than what our so-called normal was, where people are so vulnerable, where their jobs, their livelihoods, their families are so close to being at risk. So many people live below the poverty line or at the poverty line in this world anyway. And this has revealed that, and it really is put it right before us in a stark way for us to decide whether we're going to act justly on behalf of all.
And Victor, in fact, when you raise this issue, it's clear to me that inequity and marginalization also is happening in our own country here in North America.
No question.
We have Asian Americans who are being blamed for the coronavirus, much of it through a dog whistle given by our own president, sometimes a not so very obvious dog whistle. Second is we have people of color, very poor people in a country who are marginalized, African Americans. So there are communities, what we find is that there are communities who are marginalized are more impacted negatively than others with this virus that we have. But I think it's important we remember that we are only as secure as the very least amongst us. And so we have to be able to care for every part of the human body. We all function together. When one part hurts, the entire body also hurts. And I see, Joseph, you're shaking your head, so I presume you were going to speak after me.
Well, thank you, Taranjit.
I'm passing the stick to you, my friend. Here's my stick. I pass it to you.
I mean, with that colorful turban, I cannot refuse. Yeah, I mean, concretely, to answer Andrew's question, and of course, this is also an illustration of the kind of interfaith collaboration that we are celebrating and also lifting up. I mean, certainly one of the issues that I've been involved in, and there are others much more involved, is the problem of the homeless in Los Angeles. I mean, this happens at many different levels, starting with the mayor, because without going into too much detail, real estate in Los Angeles is seen as a prime economic asset, and the entire set of values around housing are economic and transactional values rather than values of care and community. And so my friend Anthony Manusas, who may be on this call, right in the city that I live in Pasadena, is together with his wife Jill Shook, organizing housing justice programs where we go to hotels and say, look, if you have so many empty rooms, that people are not going to come to, we might as well house the homeless in these, not just as a sort of short-term measure, but also as something that, as the housing market changes, takes into account people who are at the lower end of the income scale. The problem of the homeless on Skid Row and elsewhere is just horrendous in Los Angeles. And I'm very glad to report that people in all walks of life, from musicians from the LA Philharmonic who play concerts for these people and then help to find them housing, and likewise want to change the concept of home from a primarily economic and transactional idea to the idea of a space where we are able to share our love, our gifts, etc. All right, and that change that requires, of course, a multi-dimensional effort, but I think it's an important change where the idea of home is not just an economic asset that we wait to appreciate on the market, but rather one that those who are among us who are blessed with homes get to share with others who are not so blessed.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Joseph. Milia, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think, Victor talked about how this circumstance that we're living in now, it's exposed us to a lot of the injustice that's in this world, a lot of the inequality. And I think at the same time, it's also exposed us to that privilege that we also have. And I think that's a really big thing as well. Oftentimes, people may tend to have the attitude, woe unto me, why is this happening? Why is that? But I think at the same time, seeing what's happening, not just on an international level, but even on a national level. What Joseph talked about, the homelessness in Skid Row. I mean, they're everywhere as well. My office is in Long Beach, and you'll be amazed at the increased amount of homeless people that are every day, and particularly right now during this pandemic. And I think one of the responsibilities that comes out of that privilege, recognizing that that we sit in a privileged position where we can talk about this, right? Where people are just merely trying to survive it. And I think one of the things is allowing their stories to be told, and also just educating the greater mass about all the things that are happening out there. We, per the Interfaith Council, on a weekly basis, we have 3 different programs, and every Wednesday, I believe it's the Wednesday program, we have custodians of care helping the helpers, right? And it's an hour-long dialogue with individuals who are either doing work themselves or they're somehow associated with an organization that is helping those that really need the help. And it's calling all of us to get involved, that you don't have to be the director of an organization. You don't have to be this or that, but that all of us have that responsibility. Because I think, again, at least for me, certainly this whole pandemic has also highlighted the place of privilege that many of us sit in, and that maybe we didn't realize the extent of which until this happened.
That's absolutely brilliant. Ruth, go ahead.
I wanted to point out a different aspect of what's happened to us as a result of Corona. Just think about it for a moment, friends. How long did it take to close down the whole world? It's kind of remarkable. I mean, who would have believed that, 3 months ago, that what was achieved in terms of stopping people from going out, stopping people from working? I'm not talking about the consequence of that. I'm just talking about the possibility of reaching the world in such a dramatic and instantaneous way that none of us, do any of you here ever think that would have been possible? And yet we saw that happening before our eyes. So now we don't have an excuse to say, oh, we're too far, or that we don't have a connection with what's happening in other places, because we know from the dreadful statistics that are coming in all the time in each of the countries. I have two young people who are architects from Spain who have been with me for a while, and I was hearing about what was happening in Spain every single day because of them. And suddenly the Spanish tragedy was my tragedy as well, because two of your young people were here watching what was going on. And as the death toll was rising, and they were talking to their parents and urging them to stay at home and not to go to funerals and so forth. So suddenly, you know, I had it firsthand, but the truth is we all have that now. I guess this is a moment to do a shout out for Zoom. Because you remember when the internet first came out, and those of us were tangling with the idea of what would it mean, the technology, not just the facility of it, but what does it really, what's the spiritual value behind it? And I went to a lecture on the similarities between the internet and God.
Oh.
And the lecturer, I mean it, and the lecturer pointed out, he said, think of it. Everybody can be reached, no matter what their gender, ethnicity, age, color, etc. Everybody has equal access. Well, nowadays, that's almost true. We're getting there. If not, then through the Android and the iPhone. But okay, and the fact that we're all hooked up together through one net. So because technology can be our friend, in some cases it's taken away from our humanity, and we've seen that happen a lot. But it doesn't have to be. It can be our friend, and we can use it to its best advantage. So knowing that now, knowing that we could close down the whole world in a matter of weeks, how do we open the world together? How do we start with a new normal? And the new normal is one where what's happening to my friends in Kenya and in Pakistan and so forth, the call that Victor kept referring to, because it was so, I cried during the call because I felt so helpless, but we needed to be witness. And that's the other thing that I want to answer. That's what we can do for one another now too. We can serve as witnesses to grief and to pain, even if we can't do anything personally about it ourselves. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for people who are suffering to be able to have someone to hear their suffering and not walk away.
Yes.
And maybe that is the ease, Milia, that you were talking about earlier. That is the ease that another human being has fully heard what we're going through.
You know, Ruth, what you say reminds me that interconnection, right? It's a fact. And it comes both with opportunity for supporting one another, for being informed about what's going on with one another. But it also, it's one of the reasons why there's so much suffering is the fact that we're all interconnected, that what I do has an effect on you, positively and negatively. And I think that what I was hearing you all say before is that this crisis, this pandemic, has revealed some of the brokenness of our existing systems and structures and injustices. It's not that it introduced these injustices, those were already there. It's just they've been exacerbated now. So what role then should and can faith communities and interfaith communities play globally, locally, individually to transform these oppressive and broken systems that are creating ever widening gaps in our society?
I'd love to jump in on that one, Andrew. It's natural for the interfaith community to speak of collaboration, and we're actually good at not letting the differences between us block our work together, but actually to use differences to enhance our collaboration. We're good at focusing on personal living, and I think actually, I hope that we can hold on to some of the simplicity of these lockdown weeks when the doors are opened again, and the tendency will be to jump back into a sort of headlong rush of meaningless activity because we can, because there's a car in the driveway. And the meditativeness of having so many hours in one's home, which for most type A personalities is very rare. I'd like not to lose that. But that personal lifestyle change also isn't enough. And here's where the prophetic theme that's a part of the Abrahamic family seems very important. It's a time for many of us when we can think about radical social change. we can think of ways of being together where inequalities aren't just the givens of contemporary society. We can challenge that the economic globalization that's been a part of how the modern world has developed since European and American colonialism. That we have just discovered that the world's leaders are not committed to letting the invisible hand of the market control all things. That the state is willing to step in when it thinks that the people who matter are threatened. But if we now say, okay, let's think a little bit more deeply about the people who matter. Let's think about who are the essential workers in our various cultures. Let's not let that particular one go as we begin to head back to normal. It does seem, Andrew, you're right, systems and structures are exposed to visibility now in a way that they weren't before. And it gives us the chance to ask, are those the systems and structures that we actually want to maintain? And the last one, of course, is not just the essential workers who are human, but the essential workers who are more than human. Across all of nature, the ecosystems that we have been crushing are beginning to be heard again. In the cases of the birds, literally, the skies are clearing again. We have a 17% drop in greenhouse gases over many of the cities. Carbon dioxide emissions, we think, will be 8% lower for this particular year, even if we start driving our silly cars again. Isn't that a chance for us to say, it's possible? We can. We actually really can take on the most fundamental threat to society as we know it.
Brilliant. Victor, I know somebody...
If I can add to what Phil has said, I think we see some visible part of this. I have a cousin who lives in Jalandhar, Punjab in India. For the first time, he is able to see the mountains. They never thought they could see mountains from that city. So those who deny that climate change is not happening, it's a very visible reminder again to us that we as human beings, what adverse impact we do with all the technology and all the development to our common earth that we have. And so I think that's a very visible aspect of what has happened. And I hope that we as human beings will be more conscious in terms of what resources we use and how much.
Absolutely. I know Victor, oh, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, well, I mean, just very quickly, we mentioned housing, we've mentioned economic globalization, but of course there is an issue among many others, that's a pressing issue in the United States, which is that of our healthcare system. Because when we look at, again, it's a point that I and others have made, that the people being most adversely affected, now to confine our attention to the United States, we have ample statistics and to show that the people most adversely affected are the poor, who cannot get the tests, cannot go to hospital because they don't have insurance. And you know, this is an initiative that is on the ballot, all right? I mean, obviously still in the offing because of competing programs. But if anything has shown the inequity of the healthcare system, it's this virus, which has brought out how people who don't have access to healthcare are in fact dying in the thousands. And so, again, for those of us who think politically, here is something that is quite concrete and quite imminent.
Thank you, Joseph. So Victor, I really am curious to get your take on this, because I know as somebody with URI working with global networks, working with the United Nations, you know, what role should and can faith and interfaith communities play in transforming the broken systems of our world?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So I believe so strongly that this is a transforming moment, a transformational moment. And part of what's being called for is calling us out of our separation. and the illusion of our separation, whether it be separation of cultural identity or religious identity, belief identity, national identity, whatever it is, that this virus has been a profound awakening to our interdependency, to our interconnectedness. And so there's something that is fundamental about those places where we can come together. Two things come to mind, one of which is, I think, the notion, and I think the environmental and climate justice work is making this a reality too, that there are things that transcend our separateness that we must engage, and the environment and our Mother Earth and our relationship to nature is one of those things. And so there is in all spiritual traditions, all wisdom traditions, exquisite teachings about being one with life, being one with each other, understanding the kind of non-duality of life, and how this tree outside my window and I have an essential life relationship with each other that needs to be honored and needs to be respected. So going into religious and spiritual communities, indigenous communities, going into their own traditions and bringing forth the wisdom, the great wisdom that calls us into connection, and offering that up in public settings, in public spaces of discourse where we're talking about humanity and this earth, like at the United Nations. And there are incredible initiatives like the Faith for Earth initiative of the UN Environmental Program and the Interfaith Rainforest Alliance, where these things are happening. The other thing is about something about religion itself. And I think it's time to move from the notion that people of belief, people who hold beliefs, live only within religious communities, and that somehow interfaith is only concerned with people who identify with religious traditions, as beautiful as they are. And that we move to a notion that we all have beliefs that are constructed from our histories, from the ways in which we engage the world, our communities, and that they form our worldview. And our worldviews are being challenged to come together as though we can truly see each other as interdependent, or whether we're going to allow ourselves to be continually divided along identity lines and pitted against each other. So I think the religious communities, the interfaith community, needs to breathe out its space to embrace all humanity in new language as well as new actions around people of all beliefs, all worldviews, working together in this independent reality that we experience so profoundly during this pandemic, for the good of all and for the good of this earth.
Excellent.
Amen. You're here. Yeah.
I wanted, first of all, amen, indeed. That was so beautiful, Victor. I have been holding conversations with atheists for about 5 years. And one of the conclusions I came to is that they feel like pariahs, because especially in our country, where a lot of the people are still very identified with their religions, the atheists feel that they somehow, like I think the gay community felt at one time, that they were personae non gratae, and that in my conversation with them, these ideas came out, Victor, that you were just talking about, that they don't care less because they don't identify with a religious community or with a God principle. They care deeply too. And if you look at what happened at Standing Rock, I thought that was really an extraordinary moment for us too. And somehow it's connected to me in my mind with Corona, because they were addressing a different kind of virus there, People from all the different faiths showed up to stand together with the indigenous community. And it was also the first time in I don't know how long that all the indigenous people showed up to be with each other too, because there's also separations between the tribes. They don't all speak the same language, etc. They haven't had a history of togetherness. And so but the interfaith community, I think, is in a privileged place to be inclusive of the atheists or the free thinkers, or they have a lot of different names that are used for it. They're in a privileged position because we already have understood how important it is to think outside of the box and to be in the same room with people who have different ideas than we do. It's not a stretch for us. It may be a stretch for someone in a strictly religious community to be together with someone who doesn't believe in God or say that God doesn't exist. That may threaten that person, but it doesn't threaten us. So this is in a way a shout out to the interfaith community for work well done until now, because I've been involved for 30 years and I've seen huge strides and exponential participation. The ecological movement was coasting along, but the moment the interfaith and religious communities together got involved, suddenly it took off. You know, there was this added energy. And Victor, you probably know this more than any of us here, because you're dealing with this all the time. There's something about the fact that it has to do with the earth and nature and the air we breathe that is immediate and visceral for anybody who's trying to do something. So people in the audience who are again asking themselves, what can I do? One of the ways to participate, I believe, would be to get involved in ecological movements, in green faith, or even organizations that are not connected to faith, but that care about the value of the earth. Mm-hmm. And it's such a beautiful rallying point for all of us, where nobody can argue about why we're doing it. We all understand it's about existence, it's about survival, it's about appreciation, it's about food, it's everything. It's really everything. And actually I was hoping that, Philip, you might share a little more in your work about how you engage the different religious communities, and has it been an easy persuasion to get people involved? We do know that the Pew Research Society said that now 40% of young people no longer identify with any formal religion or anything that could be called dogmatic, and they're on board. So what I'm really curious to know, if you don't mind, Andrew, my asking the question, but
we do have 2 minutes, so we'll have, I wanted everybody to have a chance to give one last word before we close out. But maybe, Philip, if you can provide your closing remarks in a way that maybe address Ruth's interest.
I'll do so. 20 seconds. The sad thing is that the people who work with us in the Institute for Ecological Civilization around the world, many are religious or spiritual persons, but it's like they have to leave their hat at the doorway to come in and to be politically engaged for the sake of the earth. What we need to do is to see a greater porousness between the religious communities and groups and those who are actively engaged in the political activism. There are resources in our traditions. Why can we not grasp them? Why do we have to be schizophrenic when we're politically active for equality and peace on the one hand, and religiously active on the other? That may not be true of the people on this call, but we're finding it globally the case. Back to you, Andrew.
Joseph, a word from you to close.
Well, yeah, I'd go back to the Buddha, who says, you know, when a house is burning, you don't want to ask the chemical properties of the fire. You want to bring buckets of water and hoses. And likewise, this is a point that is made, but that I want to reiterate very briefly, and it goes back to my opening remarks, that this crisis is too good to be wasted, all right, and too dire to be wasted, because it provides us with a chance at many different levels to work for a change and a transformed world, all right? Our world is on fire, all right? And the question is, how do we put out the fire and build a new world that will not commit the same mistakes as the old order?
Beautiful. Kazanjian.
Friends, here in the United States, as you are aware, we are a country of immigrants and refugees. Our current government has not only tried to burn the house down, it is trying to gut it. We currently have a temporary halt to immigration in our country under the excuse of COVID. And friends, I am very, very concerned with the upcoming elections that we as people of faith need to look very deeply inside each other and across what Religions for Peace USA calls about, look for values that are deeply held and widely shared. And I think care for the neighbor and the immigrant refugee, friends, I believe, is one of them.
Thank you. Milia.
I think, right now we're at this extraordinary moment where we have the capacity to come together as one and to truly illustrate in our actions what oftentimes we consider just moral precepts, the concept of us being different, but coming together for a common cause. I mean, this is the time, this is when, and I see it, and I think that's beautiful. I think it's a time to address all these challenges. Equally, I think it can become very lofty. There are times when after a long day, I'm exhausted mentally, because there's so many challenges. How can I possibly make a dent in all of this? But I think that's when all of our faiths call us to look within our faith traditions, within our spiritual traditions, within our wisdom, and see that there's this huge essence of hope that's exists and that's emphasized, and how we mustn't lose that hope, and in fact utilize that hope as the catalyst to allow us to continue to really just to really continue to embark and continue to work together in this extraordinary moment that we're all living in.
Awesome. Ruth, last word from you.
What if we all could see the beauty of one expanding humanity? What if Corona could bring us that vision of our interconnectedness and our commitment to one another, that whatever happens to you also happens to me? What if?
Yeah.
Victor.
Beautiful, beautiful, Ruth. There was a question I think that came through online about what do we do with people who claim to know the mind of God or claim to inflict pain on others or force people back to work in this claiming that they're somehow speaking for God. And I think in all our traditions, there are ways to respond to that. In my tradition, we call that idolatry, that those who claim they speak on behalf of the divine are in fact committing the worst possible offense to the divine, whether they're the president of the United States or whether they're an owner of Hobby Lobby or some other group that is professing faith by actually projecting their own human failings onto others to punish others. So I just want to call that out as an important thing because it was an excellent question. And then just close with the words from the URI Charter, which is, let us unite to use our combined resources only for nonviolent, compassionate action, to awaken to our deepest truths, and to manifest love and justice among all life in our Earth community. Thank you all for this.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all panelists for being here. Thank you, audience, for your very engaging questions. I no doubt this has been a great conversation. The video from today's discussion will actually be available on Facebook momentarily. It will be uploaded to YouTube soon. And your feedback is crucial for helping us improve events like this. So please take a moment to respond to our event survey. I think a link should be in the comments section soon, but you should also, if you registered, you'll be getting an email with that as well. Thanks again for joining us. It's been wonderful. Stay safe and stay healthy, everybody.